I'm very much wearing my media studies hat, my very tattered and sometimes reluctant media studies hat. But what I really want to talk about, or to try to look at, is that if we are talking about a moment of significant far-right, radical right, electoral and mobilizing activity or non-electoral activity, what is the role, what is the function, or what are the possibilities of something that has always been historically quite pronounced in relation to moments of far-right mobilization, which is forms of anti-racist media activism, or forms of activism in relation to the media, but also within and with the media. There's a lot of discussion, obviously, about this at the moment in terms of, as Aaron rightly discussed, these kind of gateway drugs for the mainstream, Breitbart, and other kinds of so-called alt-right media sites. But I just want to put this in, first of all, in a little bit of context, because I'm not a far-right researcher. I've been writing more recently, or researching more broadly recently, about racisms in digital media culture and the transnationalization of different kinds of racializing ideas and tropes and so forth. And I was working with Ashamin's notion of what he calls racial debris, that idea that under certain moments or in the conjuncture, certain forces, that certain kinds of racial ideas, racial references come back with what he calls a kind of uncommon force, exactly what Aaron was describing there, in the range of kind of references which you see in the Trump moment. And I was trying to think of this in terms of not just racial debris, but digital debris. In other words, that what we have, if you look at any particular Facebook group, for example, or if you look at the sort of compound feeds that we see online, we get a circulation of a kind of extended archiving repertoire of racialized artifacts, images, rhetorics, knowledge claims, which can be sort of the logic of the digital bricolage. They can be brought together in ways, and they can be put together in ways which are also uncommon and sometimes not uncommon force. And looking at that in terms of an older idea, Les back John Solomon's idea that racism is a scavenger ideology. It gains its power from the ability to pick out and utilize ideas and values from other sets of ideas and beliefs in particular contexts. So what I've been looking at really in ways, when do these moments, when does debris become shrapnel? When does it become something that can be used, that can be weaponized, that becomes powerful in a particular discursive situation, more wider in a particular political situation? Now, one of the reasons that I want to emphasize this kind of logic is that when we start to talk often about media and the far right, there's a very comforting way in which the far right appears to map onto the wilds of the internet. It all happens out there beyond the media institutions. It happens out there in the wilds of the non-public sphere. And that's something that's very, very comforting until something happens, such as the aftermath of Anders Breivik's attacks in Oslo and Utøya, where what his so-called his manifesto, his 1,700-page manifesto. I remember when manifestos were like a page and a half, so people could mobilize around them. This is a 1,700-page cut-and-paste manifesto, which revealed absolutely the kind of ideological linkages and thinking between the so-called wilds of the blogosphere, which was very comfortingly out there, and the mainstream media. But more systematically, I think we need to get away from thinking about the old and the new, the internet and the mainstream, in the kinds of terms that Andrew Chadwick puts forward, what he calls an idea of the hybrid media system, which is not to dispute the way in which power and resources are distributed, and communicative resources and power distributed in the media system, but to look at the way in which he says old media logics influence new media logics and vice versa, and therefore they often create these sort of contingent spaces of political possibility, which are open for progressive and anti-racist organizing, but of course equally open for, as we've been talking about, forms of racist and far-right organizing. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean by that. 2015, the week after the quite extraordinary circulation of the image of Alan Kurdi's body on a beach in Turkey, a particular character called Henry Riley, who was kicked out of UKIP, which is always quite a feat, you have to admit, though they do try to kill each other quite regularly in democratic halls. But Henry Riley, who was kicked out for a kind of financial irregularity of some kind or some sort of internal matter, was on BBC Northern Ireland's The Nolan Show, where he was talking about how it would be catastrophic for Northern Irish society to receive something like 30 Syrian refugees or whatever it might have been, because it might lead to conflict in Northern Ireland. And he gave this particular speech talking about ghettos, that he knows parts of London where you can't walk your dog because your dog is unclean and it won't be accepted by the local radical Islamic communities. He was straining at political correctness in the way in which he was speaking, and he was pressed on it and said, where do you see these ghettos? And the ghettos, of course, are always somewhere else. It's a racialized imagery that's always projected onto somewhere else. And he said, look at Malmo in Switzerland. Geography test. That has brought in huge numbers of Islamic refugees. It has gone from being the safest city in Europe to being the most crime-ridden. It has become the rape capital of the world because Islamic culture does not recognize women in the same protectionist way that we do. And you can see the way they can't ever quite get this feminist language that they're trying to appropriate, this protectionist way. So, of course, he said this, and people laughed, and he started and said, no, look at Malmo in Switzerland, and they laughed even more, and he powered on through. Now, it is funny, and it's funny because, of course, the laughter, the feedback meant nothing to the sort of ritual nature of this particular talking point. But if we step outside of it for a moment and wonder, how did he arrive at the idea that Malmo was in Switzerland? Switzerland, of course, is celebrated as a particular kind of terrain in the far-right imagery because of the minarets referendum of 2009, where this was a way, if you like, this was a way in which the March of Eurabia was held back. Malmo, as Val was talking about earlier, in particular, urban areas in Sweden are always held up as these sort of lost territories, the territories that have been over-ethnicized. We're aware of those kinds of discourses and how they manifest in different countries. So, in one way, he's sort of mixing up his talking points. He's mixing up these bits of the imaginary of the decline of European civilization and the grand replacement of populations and so forth. But that's after you actually start to look for where he might have got some of these facts. This is a report from 6 months later in the London Independent, which is reporting on a report by the European Agency for Fundamental Rights, which was looking at the prevalence of reports of sexual harassment and sexual assault in European countries. And it was commenting on very high levels of reporting in Denmark and Sweden. And the report itself, if you look at it, is looking at the ways in which the definitions of sexual assault have changed and how this has facilitated increased reporting, how different kinds of social services available have also made it safer for people to report forms of assault and harassment. But what it then does is it links to something called a report in the Gatestone Institute, or quotes it here. According to the Institute, in 1975, the Swedish Parliament unanimously decided to change the former homogenous Sweden into a multicultural country. Right? That's what the Swedish Parliament apparently did in 1975. They had a vote on this. You see something like this, you follow the hyperlinks, it leads to a place called the Gatestone Institute, which I had a presentation on yesterday, a particular neocon astroturfing research institute, and where the report itself, what it does, is it basically runs together, it runs a kind of very clever correlation between the increase in immigration and increase in reporting of statistics, but then takes them as causation. And this is reported in the London Independent by two authors who are associated with something called Dispatch International, which is again one of the sort of front groups which is created between certain organizations in the US and in Nordic countries in the aftermath of the Ulan's Post and Mohammed Khartoum's affair. There's a whole other sort of story to tell there. But I make this point because when we have now in the Trump moment all of this sort of hysteria about false news and fake news, which is being deliberately circulated as propaganda, we need to look at it far more systemically. This is something which is facilitated by the political economy of mainstream journalism. This is the consequence of speed, it's a consequence of media piecework, it's a consequence of Google as a main research framework. But what it does, and it was Nazanin and Tom and David's presentation on this was very good yesterday on the 5 pillars of Islamophobia and the need to look at actual practices and where the sources are. But if we look also at the way in which the logics of the internet create certain logics of circulation, what Adam Klein calls a sort of information laundering, where actually you can't trace it back to some kind of origin. What we're looking at here is a sort of racialized structure of knowledge, a racialized common sense which is available, which is integrated into mainstream media frameworks, ways of defining the problem. Now that's a kind of lengthy introduction to what I really want to talk about today, but I wanted to sort of underline some of these logics that we're looking at within the media system when we come to look at certain political tactics which were formed in another, not just another political moment, but another media moment as well. these questions about platform that I'm going to look at have actually been something I've been thinking about much more politically and less as a researcher in Ireland, where almost uniquely, but not exceptionally, but for historical reasons, there isn't a mobilized far-right in the way in which there is in many other European countries, but there's an extraordinary media focus on creating artificial forms of balance, whereby anyone who literally sets up a Facebook group calling themselves a new party is invited onto talk shows and is invited into the audience of different television formats and so forth. So the question that I wanted to try to ask, and it's not a question that I will answer, but just try to give some different ideas, is if we think about anti-racist media activism as a form of labour, in the context of media ubiquity and media abundance, we need to put our political energies in certain places very carefully and in very strategized ways. What are the kinds of anti-racist media activity that are adequate to the media system that we have and the nature and forms of far-right activity that we have? Now clearly within that there's a lot I can't cover, but I want to just focus or try to drill down into one recent example and from that open up a variety of different questions about the media system and the far right. From looking very briefly at a recent call for no platform or for a no platform response to the appearance of Marine Le Pen on the Andrew Marr show on Sunday, November 13th, which happens to be Remembrance Sunday. And it was a pre-recorded interview in Paris, which was broadcast. And quite extraordinarily, it was prefaced by Marr looking at the camera and speaking to the public and explaining why they had chosen to conduct this interview and why they had chosen to broadcast it on this particular day. So as you can see here what he does is he says, I know that people are offended and upset. I know that the symbolism of this on Remembrance Sunday, which is obviously a day which is marinated in the mythologies of state official anti-fascism. And then he gives this kind of idea at the end that also we need to talk about her because she's the next big challenge to Western security, meaning she has some kind of relationship with Putin. So it's a very, very particular framing that Marr feels apologetic within. But of course, the objections to Marine Le Pen appearing on the show were very, very different, and they had an awful lot to do with not just the racializing nature of her politics, but the way in which the Front National acts as also a mobilizing center of gravity for other movements which are not defined by their formal relationship to the party, but are certainly energized by their informal relationships to that party. And what her politics does, of course, is simply relentlessly focus, as much spectrum of French politics does, relentlessly focus on the Muslim, but the Muslim is what Christine Delphi calls this sort of classed and racialized other. So there was a number of critical responses to this, obviously. There was a call for no platform from some within the Labour Party. United Against Fascism obviously mounted a picket on the morning of the broadcast, but of course the programme itself was pre-broadcast, so it was a kind of symbolic picket. There was nobody really to stop coming in and out. There was predictable counters to this in terms of, as you can see here, Robin Aitken in the Telegraph saying that censoring Marine Le Pen would damage a free society and can't resist framing it in a certain kind of way, where he says that, where is it? The BBC has finally learned, in giving her a platform, the BBC has finally learned that liberal orthodoxy cannot ignore and delegitimize contrarian views. So Marine Le Pen is just a set of contrarian views. There was also, though, and this was much more prevalent, a criticism of how the interview was actually conducted. I mean, if you look at the image there, Andrew Marr's sort of dramatic introduction to the French concept of mise en scène, look at the way in which this has been set up. Marine Le Pen is allowed to present herself against a dark background with the French flags presidentially arrayed behind her. While I don't know if you saw it, but Marr sits in the light with the French Brexit poster behind his head, as if he's been set up almost as a parody. And so there's a lot of focus on the conduct of the interview. And that's something going to an incident previous to this, an interview with a neo-Nazi on London local television. This is something that Media Diversified have been talking about, the need to, at some level, maybe we need to accept that the BBC has to give legitimacy to these as political actors, but we really need to think about the ways in which they're legitimating their ideas. Is there something else that journalism can do? Okay, to skip on, and I've radically overestimated the amount of material I can get through here, but if you look at this, the tactic which has been called for here, the tactic of no platform. One of the issues that we have, as we've seen, is to look at what does it mean to ask for no platform in a multi-platform era. In other words, where there are lots of other forms of media coverage around. But something like the BBC is obviously of highly symbolic and institutional value. So there's a tension there, if you like, between two different dimensions of the appearance. The other, as people have mentioned, and as Emmanuel Godin puts very well, is that if you focus on one political party, if you focus on the actor, what does that mean actually for the message and the publics which are being addressed within the far right? He talks about the far right as a heteroclite family where we need to pay attention to the different relationships between movements and not just focus on parties. But, so there's a complexity to calling for no platform in the current political situation, in the current media context. But I think if we go back to some histories, which I will now gloss over in a highly irresponsible fashion, if we go back to some histories of no platforming, it has always been complex as a political tactic. I think that's the first thing. It is made more complex in some ways by the nature of the political movements we're looking at in the media system, but it has always been complex and contradictory and conflicted, particularly in relation, for example, to whether the focus is the mobilization of fascist actors, preventing them from organizing, also in terms of organizing in the public of the airwaves, or whether the target is actually racist ideas, which means that it's racism as expressed, not necessarily by fascist actors, but also by racist ideologues of various kinds. But when I've been going back into the histories here, as I said, that I will now gloss over, of forms of no platforming, one of the things which is crucial in looking at these histories is that they're very much based on forms of coalition from within and without the media. Many of you will have seen the Stuart Hall, Maggie Steed, It Ain't Half Racist documentary about racism in the media, and the book which subsequently came after that, It Ain't Half Racist, which looks at the work of the Coalition Against Racism in the Media and the Black Media Workers Associations and others. But what's interesting, if we go back to this period and try to think about what tactics we'll look at now, or what are the resources from anti-racism in the past to think about the present period, what runs through all of the various ways in which they think about tackling not just fascist ideas, but fascist ideas as part of the relationalities which produce racism in the public sphere. One of the things they constantly come back to is the need to organize in relation to journalism, in other words, pressure on journalism, but to organize with journalists. Now again, there's many reasons why those forms of activism have become more difficult or have changed shape today. If we just focus on this idea of putting pressure on coverage which grants a certain kind of legitimacy to fascist or far-right particular actors. In relation to the BBC, for example, in particular, Sarita Malik's work has been really, really good at looking at the way in which these early anti-racist energies were folded into institutional notions, first of all, of multiculturalism, but then subsequently cultural diversity, and more latterly, what's come to be known as creative diversity. In other words, the idea that almost anyone can learn to appreciate diversity, so your embodied political subjectivity, in other words, you can actually have a BBC or a media system which is full of white men who have learned to think in diverse ways, and they can then, if you like, work that through production logics and editorial approaches and so forth. There's also, of course, the fact that the landscape of employment in journalism has changed quite radically. It's much more based, like elsewhere, most other areas of the economy, on precarious forms of employment, which make that kind of organizing more difficult. And I will conclude. And there's also, I think, obviously a changed landscape of media production, where it's polycentric. Even if the big media institutions are still quite important in symbolic terms, there are other places for people to produce countervailing material, for example. And also at the same time, there's a sense in which I think in the instantaneous flow of social media, media critique is available to everybody. You can critique the text, there's an everyday politics of representation, but it's still very much from outside the media institution. Okay, I'm going to conclude there. I think, in a sense, what I'm calling for here by doing drastic damage to the superficiality which would have presented these movements and tactics, but is really to emphasize that I think if we're going to look at effective anti-racist media work, it has to come back to thinking about not just the complexities that we're looking at, but the nature of these kinds of coalitions and where they could come from in terms of the kinds of groups which are which exist today. And I know that at the moment, actually, there is a kind of movement that Gary Young is involved in around media workers stand up against racism, which is very much trying to challenge something which goes right back if you look at that whole documentary, what they're really trying to challenge is this notion that you can be objective in relation to racism. Very, very old debates taking on slightly different form. But I can talk more, I think, in the discussion perhaps about the particular ways in which I think this is very, very difficult in terms of contemporary journalism, contemporary news-making structures and other things. But at least a slightly optimistic one to end on, which is we need to build these kinds of coalitions. So I'm happy.
So that was 3 wide-ranging, thought-provoking presentations. So I'll open it up to the audience and we'll start taking some questions. Yeah, if you could introduce yourself as well. Yeah.
My name is Emma from the University of Aberdeen.
Stephen, could I ask you? Sorry, Emma, if you could just press the red button.
It's amazing how far eye contact gets you. That's twice I've been made eye contact.
Yeah, it's also because they know your name.
One of them's in a battery. That's you're almost there. Should last.
Okay, my question is actually for Gavin, and I know you weren't really talking about the US yourself, but it came up overall. And
which came up? Sorry, I didn't do this. Which came up? What came up?
The United States.
Okay.
Because I know you weren't necessarily discussing that yourself, but it's inescapable at the moment. And particularly with the increased internationalization of media with the internet, so the Daily Mail, for example, being immensely popular in America, whereas American media is broadcast here. Are you concerned, or do you think there's a concern that while saying that it's absolutely crucial that this sort of work we've been discussing gets done, that the media will actually shy away from doing it because of how, say, Donald Trump has treated media outlets that have been critical of him, obviously most famously calling CNN fake news and refusing to take their question, threatening to kick people out, and that they're going to shy away from work with activists, they're going to shy away from work which is tackling issues such as racism so that they preserve their own jobs, essentially.
If we could take one more question.
First, thank you for the very, very interesting 3 papers. My name is Edgar Klusner. I'm from the University of Manchester. And I would like to continue where you have just stopped. Another question to Gavin. Do you think anti-racist strategies developed by the media can be effective at all? I mean, the target audience now lives in an alternative media universe, which is catered for by specialized research institutes like the Gatestone you mentioned, or the Middle East Forum of Daniel Pipes. There are plenty of them. They have the Daily Mail, the Sun, others. They have Breitbart, this new British version of Breitbart. Aaron Hunt is starting. They have no need to engage with traditional mainstream media. I pretty much fear that it will become increasingly impossible to address an audience that has already found the media.
Okay, thank you. Aaron, sorry, Gavin, do you want to come back on those 2?
Yeah, I can try. If you can hear me without a microphone, it's okay. Yeah, I take your point. I think there's a lot more to looking at the way that sort of racism is often discussed. One of the things that, not in relation to the far right, but more generally, I've been writing about is the way in which the denial of racism functions through what I call a kind of debatability. In other words, always discussing, does this count as racism? Who gets to define whether this is racist or not? So in other words, racism is hiding in plain sight. Racism is constantly being talked about, but it's always something which is contingent. It's always something which is an accusation, and that means that it's very, very difficult, I think, to conduct an analysis of racist politics in that kind of context. So I think it's got partly to do with the fact that, yes, clearly, not just Trump, but there is an increasing, in terms of what Nero was talking about, there's also an increasing sense in which journalists are there to be bullied, right? And sometimes in very extreme ways. But I think that it's also, what that kind of journalism can't do is provide a sort of sociological analysis or political analysis of racism adequate to the media form. Most journalism looks at he said, she said, what's one side of the political spectrum doing, what's the other side of the political spectrum saying in response. It's very sort of formulistic, it's very mechanistic in the way in which it looks at what the political spectrum is like. So I think there are long-standing problems with that. But I think as well, if you look at, I think one of the problems as well in the kind of media economy that we have is that racism is sensational, it sells. BuzzFeed is constantly full of these sort of essays of, look what was said on Twitter, here's the 10 best anti-racist tweets of the year or whatever. It's a form of content, it circulates as content, and it gets inoculated as content to a certain extent too. I absolutely take your point. I think there's two things there. One is we need to be specific about media institutions because they have imagined publics and they also have real publics, but to a certain extent those publics are becoming more and more unknowable to them because of course they have very sophisticated forms of research, but those publics are becoming more and more unknowable to them simply because of the nature of the fragmentation of the media landscape. Now I think this makes public service broadcasters, for example, particularly vulnerable to populist logics, because if you're constantly told that the silent majority thinks this, you can't risk that the silent majority isn't actually part of your audience. So there's a temptation to sort of let's represent all sides and let those sides fight it out amongst themselves and withdraw from a particular kind of editorial role in relation to those opinions. And I think that that's one of the things that's happened, which is if you want to debate about immigration, let's have a couple of migrant voices, let's have a couple of racists, and the migrants have to prove why they have a right to actually be here and have a viable life, and that's balance. That's one of the things I think professionally which is happening. In relation to these sort of media spheres, they are very activist driven, but they're also kind of for net dilettantes at a certain level. If you look at exactly some of the networks that you're talking about, they are not echo chambers, they are not filter bubbles. They're actually obsessed with monitoring the mainstream media. They are the most dedicated connoisseurs of everyday media content, but they use it to constantly reconstruct the worldview and the conspiracy theories that they have. But there's something I think more important, which is that outside of those kinds of groups, the far-right movements in Europe are very sophisticated at playing the logics of mainstream media and also increasingly sophisticated producers of media themselves in ways that put pressure on mainstream media logic. So that's why I think, yes, to a certain extent, certain sort of activist online areas are not there to be democratically persuaded. But I think that media institutions need to think about who's in the public. And one of the things that's happening constantly in these migration debates and other debates is that the public is being reimagined as white constantly. Because we need to have an open debate about this, we need to admit there's a problem. Much of the work, which was very basic work around questions of representation and thinking about the diversity of the audience in very schematic ways, a lot of that seems to me to be being undone at the moment.
Thanks, Gavin. Further questions? I know we've got one from Shirin. Okay, we'll take the two of you. Shirin first, and
Thanks, yeah, I thought they were all really good talks. I had one question for everyone, which kind of followed on from the last speaker talking about Gary Young's really great initiative of media workers stand up to racism, and which I guess kind of shows a kind of initiative around building within workplaces, like and going back to the kind of 1980s, where you saw the real role of media workers when they refused in the Sun to have a front page attacking Scargill one day. So that kind of initiative I think is really important. And I wondered if the speakers could talk a bit more about generally kind of anti-racism and anti-fascism in America and Britain, what the solution, what kind of things are coming about, and what's hopeful in terms of a movement. And just a quick plug, because obviously Trump is been inaugurated. Has he been inaugurated, or I don't know? 5 months ago. Obviously there'll be a lot of protests, massive protests in America. There's also protests in London right now outside the US Embassy. So a few of us, I think, will be going down to the US Embassy after this conference to join the anti-Trump protests.
Thanks very much. Just if we were to categorize the last 20 years wars in the sort of Middle East and North Africa as sort of populist, right-wing, racist wars, saying for a moment we were to categorize them in that sort of way, could you say a few words about how the media has approached those wars in terms of if one was to see those wars in that form?
Could we take one final question? Just the woman right at the back.
I have to have a microphone. So
Okay.
it's
being recorded, so it's better that...
I'm sure everyone can hear me speak. I think what's kind of disturbing a bit is this whole discussion about the emerging fascism that we've had here, via Brexit. I don't think it's just, there's always been low-level fascism in this country, but also what's happened in the States with the election of Trump, and sort of this amnesia, it seems, about the rest of the world. For example, what's happening in India with Modi, and what's happening in Hungary, for example, and in other places. And I think there needs to be more of a discussion about that, because I don't think that was fleshed out. I feel like there's such a focus on the Anglo-Atlantic side of things that we tend to forget that it's not just a movement that's happening from here, but it's happening all around, and it's interconnected financially, with the corporate state, just in every aspect. So I would appreciate a discussion about that if we've done.
Okay, thank you. Nina, do you want to comment first?
I absolutely agree with you, except that you're saying that we didn't mention it. This was my point of departure, and I mentioned the Prime Minister of Hungary. I didn't mention particularly Modi here, but obviously he's very important. And I was part of a international women's delegation to the Gujarat after the pogroms against the Muslims, when Modi was the governor of the Gujarat, and we were there just after the local elections. And the human rights defenders who were working there, remember especially one of them who'd been working so hard to try and get some drinking water to one of the villages, and this villager told him, "Don't want water, want Modi." And this was some kind of an embodiment of the importance of this identity politics, which this kind of fundamentalist, far-right populism represents. And this is why I said in the South, the crisis of governability and governmentality started earlier with a so-called restructuring of, as a conditionality of aid. I think it was during the 80s, and the growing of inequalities and other post-colonial, there's no time to deal with it now. But that links to the question about anti-racist struggles, because the worst kind of anti-racist struggles are the ones that buys the dichotomies of the racist movements. Those who just try to reverse the kind of power relations. I was not here yesterday when there was a discussion about anti-Muslim racism, but one of the important issues to understand in relation to what was said here, that if any critique of any Muslim is considered racism against Muslims, this is racist, because it homogenizes all the Muslims. It devalues all the amazing struggles of human rights defenders and feminists all over the South, as well as in the North, against some of the fundamentalist, far-right, fascist, I don't buy fascist because analytically, but it doesn't matter, populist movement. So the important thing of anti-racism is this legitimacy of this diversity that we're talking about, that are being erased. Legitimacy of the need for intersectional dialogical epistemology and creating alliances across borders and boundaries without pretending they do not exist, but without also verifying these boundaries and borders and homogenizing them. And I think this is what is important today, maybe more than ever, because of this, in the name of eternal, fluid diversity, there is reification, homogenization, and erasure of all the progress that the good side of fluid globalization have done in the last 40 years.
Aaron, too.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing in response to Sharon, and then another thing in response to the issue about wars. Just speaking about the United States in terms of anti-racism, and I think I've seen some pretty amazing stuff with an organization like the Southern Poverty Law Center just radically multiply their work. Everything from labor rights to housing rights, teaching tolerance, lawsuits, monitoring the media, etc. It's really good stuff. That's heavily resourced. I've also seen some sort of grassroots networks establishing on progressive coalitions online and things like that, creating databases. Right now you've got Black Lives Matter protesting and blocking
the route in. Yeah.
Yeah, blocking
they're stopping Trump supporters getting in right now.
You've seen great stuff. Except my cynicism kicks in, partly because what I've seen happen over this, part of my argument about the relationship between the far right and the mainstream right is what the sort of the material that links them up that has made this possible, and I think that's in this case too, is anti-racism, which is becoming increasingly prolific, active on the media, etc. like that. And I mean, this goes to your point about how they monitor the media. I mean, I have to, to my horror, I've been listening to a lot of sort of Breitbart and sort of alt-right podcasts and stuff like this, and I'm amazed at the mobilization of students in America, and anti-racism, anti-feminism, except where it comes to Islamophobia, but definitely anti-trans. And there's just the mobilization of these kind of sentiments, and the free speech stuff as well. And I don't know that, see, like Gavin said, they monitor the mainstream media and what they call the left-wing media, but I don't know how left-wing it is. The left liberal tends to kind of shy away from the right, monitoring the right in the same way for a whole host of obvious reasons. One of which is not motivated by hate and obsessiveness, but so what worries me is the mobilization of anti-racism and anti-other sort of anti what they call social justice. I think and I'm not sure how that is dealt with. In terms of, again, just to link that back in, I don't think people live in an alternative media. I mean, I think we can see campus campaigns against the tabloids, the role of the tabloids in Brexit, and in Trump in New York, particularly with the New York tabloids. Traditional media still can be quite active. To link that in, the big media conglomerates are still powerful, but maybe less influential. So to go to the question about wars, I wouldn't classify wars as populist or necessarily racist in a focused way. Imperialist, and there's racism built into that. Populism, particularly in America, has tended to be isolationist on the right and the left. And in fact, I think what you've seen recently is, for all his military aggression, Trump is building on a Tea Party-esque right that has largely been motivated on one half by Obama and racism, but also on small government, anti-Bush, anti-war on terror. They want to keep Guantanamo open, but they don't want to spend any more money. So I don't know that you can describe that as populist, but what I would say in terms of the media, one of the things we've seen lost and I don't say that in a bad way, CNN exploded because of their wall-to-wall coverage of the first Gulf War. So in a sense, we've seen, you know, we've seen the media landscape change as much as we may not have seen the Gulf War's situation change. But yeah, that's.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. Final word to you, Gavin.
I mean, maybe on the question of anti-racist organising, but I restrict my comments to this question of media coverage. I think that in this context of more or less infinite media content and limited activist resources, the what's targeted and why needs to be quite strategically worked through. I think there are some very good things at the moment, in the sense of very targeted campaigns. So targeting post-Brexit, as you said, targeting the tabloids for, you know, what's the campaign called? Basically targeting advertisers for you know, some hateful anti-migrant publishing. I think that's one tactic, is about exacting the cost. Is there a cost that can be exacted, and how can people organise around that cost? I think when it comes to the wider question of something like the BBC, I mean, one of the things I skipped over, Tom Mills's book on the BBC is very good, and Val alluded this morning to the way in which a hegemony always sees itself somehow as counter-hegemonic. One of the things that has been internalized very much within the BBC is this sense of we were too soft on immigration, we were too politically correct, we didn't represent people's views. And that's something which has been, that's something I think which is created institutionally, but it's also something which has been created because of these particular kinds of political campaigns which have been mobilized around that, particularly in the late 2000s. And Tom, I think, documents that very, very well. I think that's why I would emphasize this kind of coalitional work, which is to find ways of making it clear that that has to be pulled back from. That this is an institutional vision which is actually more out of touch with the public than this idea that we have to what's the word I'm looking for, compensate for these decades of political correctness, is what's very much out of touch, I think, with the public. But again, these are, I think, huge efforts to organise around.
Please.
Can I
absolutely.
say one word? I think one very important front for anti-racist organizing is the impact of the new immigration legislation in Britain. What we've been calling everyday bordering, and we also filmed a campaign together with Migrant Rights Network and a whole kind of consortium about this, which I believe has had quite an effect on Brexit, because by sensitizing everybody all the time, everywhere, to prove that they are legitimate here, that they are not illegitimate or illegal border crossers, they have to prove their citizenship status, where they work, where they study, where they live, where they go to health and so on. And this development, I mean, also I talked about the crisis of vulnerability. This was one way in which governments very easily could show that they fulfill their role to make their population safe. But the reality is that it's not safe. The penetration of border authorities to social care, to all, even I was attending a debate on the fact that border officers now would sit in labor tribunals, which are supposed to defend the rights of workers. And when somebody challenged them, why they would be, I said, yes, of course, the rights of workers have to be defended if they are legal, if they are legitimate, if they are, so there is a penetration, as well as encouraging of everybody to tell everybody else about everybody else that they are not legal and legitimate. This is something that has become normalized and is penetrating to every area of life. And I think this is something that we all have to resist with all our might.
It's a very important place to conclude. So please join me in thanking you. I think it's a tea and coffee break.
And cake. And also, I've brought sandwich bags, so if people feel there's too much cake, and you can take some for your journey home, because it will go in the bin, and it is a sin, even for non-believers. Hungry people out in Stratford Station, get a bag for me if you can carry a cake. Thank you.
Let's find out why people talk.
No.
Yeah.
Did you bring my draft?
Yeah.
I want to interview you on the paper I'm doing on Monday.
Yesterday, I know they threw away loads of food because I wasn't prepared for how to carry it and just so
Here he is, look, there's Paul.
It's no good.
Yeah, do it, Chris.
I have seen your talk. I have told her that was like postcode, but I didn't say where it was.
Now how to do this?
I really told